Welcome to Israel in Depth, where scholars, policymakers, and leading experts come to discuss topics about Israel in depth. You're listening to a podcast by the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the host of this podcast. Joining me for this episode of Israel in Depth is Professor Jonathan Rynhold. He's the chair of the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University and a senior researcher at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. He was previously the Schusterman Visiting Professor of Israeli Politics at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Professor Rynhold specializes in Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy, the Arab-Israeli peace process, U.S.-Israel relations, and Israeli politics and foreign policy. His book, The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture, which was published by Cambridge University Press, won the Israeli Association for Political Science Prize for the best book of 2015. I strongly recommend you read it if you want to know about the shifts and changes in American public opinion and American politics vis-a-vis Israel. His most recent publication, co-authored with Toby Green, is an article titled, quote, An Israeli Strategy for a Post-Hamas Gaza. We're going to discuss that article in some depth. But first, let me welcome you onto the program and thank you for joining me today, Jonathan.
Hi, Dov. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So before we discuss the question of a post-Hamas Gaza, I think, we should first of all begin by talking about the possibility for a post-Hamas Gaza. We're now 6 weeks into this war. There's currently a pause as hostages have been released, and this pause is being extended day by day. There's now, some question about whether, in fact, Israel will resume the war, and if it does, whether it's going to be able to achieve its goal of defeating Hamas in the Gaza Strip and toppling Hamas from power there. So why do you feel confident that there will be a post-Hamas Gaza? In other words, that Israel will be able to eliminate Hamas's presence from the Gaza Strip?
So I think we wrote the article actually to help Israel destroy Hamas. And that is that if you are President Biden and you're the Prime Minister of Britain or France, President of France or Chancellor of Germany, and you say Hamas must be destroyed straight away, first day, very clear, it means they all see this as a really important goal. But in order to be able to justify this, and there's a lot of civilians dying, you have to be able to present a vision which says not only is this going to be better for Israel, it's going to be better for the people of Gaza. And so the idea of presenting a vision which can be good for both is actually something that we did in order to try and help Israel maintain the legitimacy internationally in order to go ahead and defeat Hamas.
So you wrote that about a month ago. In the month that's followed, do you see any erosion of the support or the commitment for that goal? I mean, do you think you follow U.S. politics closely and the U.S. debate about Israel, and do you see any signs of a shift toward maybe accepting or pushing for a conclusion which will not bring about this post-Hamas Gaza?
So I would say that most of the noise in American politics and in American campuses is not making a difference to American policy. And the way to think about it is to start with what President Biden said, which is Israel must destroy Hamas, but it must do it in a way that fits in with the rules of war, like what distinguishes civilized countries from barbarians. So the idea being that you do not target civilians and that you try indeed to cause as little damage as possible, but that in the end, the primary responsibility for using civilians as a shield is with Hamas, but Israel has to do its part. So what I see is the administration asking Israel, how are you going to do this? I think that's the question. I don't think there's a disagreement on the parameters of the war. I think that's pretty solid, and I think it's pretty solid with the main American allies, with the partial exception of France. So that's where we're up to. I think that during this pause, what we've seen is behind the scenes discussions. And Israel, the IDF is thinking in terms of moving people in South Gaza as they move, and then the people move. And also in terms of setting up a safe zone along the coast. But it is hard to see how there cannot be displacement, because if you can imagine a battlefield in which Hamas is under you on the same level and also in apartment blocks, the only way to do that carefully and to minimize civilian damage is actually to get the civilians out the way.
Basically, what they did in northern Gaza.
Yeah, but what I imagine it would be is more of a smaller area by smaller area, slower. And also, I imagine prioritizing where they think Sinwar's headquarters is, which is Khan Yunis. Although, given the 500 kilometers of tunnels, I'm not sure what that means, in a tactical sense. So I think that's where we are. I think that while the Israeli public has very, very much wanted the hostage deals to go ahead, at a certain point, and I don't think we're that far away from it, the priority will go back to defeating Hamas. I think it's important to understand from the Israeli public's point of view, you have 300,000 to 400,000 people who've been moved from their homes in the south and in the north. And the north is because basically the Hamas strategy is out of the Hezbollah playbook. And you have those Hezbollah people right on the border. And so people, if you have 400,000 people who are not prepared to return to their homes, that creates an emboldening effect on all sorts of terrorists all around Israel and possibly elsewhere in the world. And so, although Israel isn't under direct threat of extinction from Hamas, it is a very important inflection point, as President Biden said, because if they're allowed to get away from this without being fully defeated, then the path towards much bigger confrontations and much worse situations will be open.
Yeah, so in a sense, fundamentally, the political will, both in Jerusalem and in Washington, remains for the total defeat of Hamas. And they still seem to be, despite, as you said, some differences of opinion, basically aligned on that core objective. And notwithstanding everything that's happened over the last month, they're still in that position. The question, just to go pick this up more on the ability to defeat Hamas, is what we've seen, obviously, in the hostage releases, is that at the moment, Hamas is still standing. Hamas is still able to maintain basic command and control. It was able to ensure a ceasefire. Yahya Sinwar was basically still in control of things. He's calling the shots. They're able to access the hostages, determine. So after a month of more than a month of, the heaviest Israeli bombardment that Hamas have ever faced, well beyond anything that Hamas have endured in the past, it is still standing, even in northern Gaza. So do you think, there are now, many voices who are saying not necessarily it shouldn't be done, right? But rather it cannot be done, that Hamas won't be defeated or that the cost is too high, and that you think that you still think that it's possible for Israel and if to defeat Hamas? And if so, what do you imagine to be the time frame? I know you're not a military strategist, but how long might?
Yeah. So what has happened in this conflict is that Israeli ground forces have performed much better than anybody thought they would. And part of that is to do with technology. So it's generally thought that when an army is in a built-up area, it's the most dangerous thing because you don't know what's around every corner. You're slow. Terrorists are fast and can come in and out, up and down and up. Israel is using ground troops with tanks and with Mazlatin. Now I can't remember the word in English. What are they called? Those flying drones. Gosh, how terrible. Okay, yes, drones. And so the drones basically allow you to look round the corner, okay, and to see things and all the rest. What does that mean? It means that you go slower, right? But you're able to take less losses and inflict less losses. You can be more precise. Although when you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds every single day, there are limits. So what does that mean? It means that the IDF is very confident that they can defeat Hamas. That's the first thing. The second thing is they think it will take months. Yeah, something between 2 and 4 months. Okay, and that doesn't mean that Israel will be fighting at the same intensity all the time. And it may well be that what President Biden is asking for is less intensity. And it's not clear to me, but that's possible. So I do think that the Israeli public and the IDF are firmly believe that Israel must and can do this. The only actor externally who really has a say here is the President of the United States. And it just so happens that the President of the United States is Israel's best friend in American politics, full stop. And is also the one who has the greatest sort of experience in understanding the Middle East. And you can see by the speed of his decisions, right, which is unprecedented in the whole history of US-Israeli relations, that he is personally playing a very, very important role. So I think, Israelis pray in synagogue for the IDF every week and they pray for the state of Israel. I think they'll have to add a prayer for the president of the United States just to be on the safe side. But yeah,
probably
I hope that answers your question.
Probably for his re-election as well, but we'll save that for another day. Let me ask you then, okay, so assuming that Israel, whether it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 months, that eventually the IDF will get the job done, will be able to defeat Hamas. Then the big question, of course, is, the day after, what comes next? When you wrote your article about a month ago, part of it was kind of a plea to think about this, right? To actually address this now rather than later, which in some ways is not very Israeli, but, to actually think ahead of the time and to plan. Do you think there's been, since you wrote that and calling for that plan, calling for that serious thought, do you think that has been happening within the Israeli government? I mean, how much thinking and serious discussion is taking place? I want to talk about what the various options are in a moment, but in terms of has there been that kind of response that you were calling for?
So if we divide this up into the government, the higher levels of the IDF and the overall security apparatus of the state of Israel. So the government won't touch this with a barge pole, right? Doesn't want to know, because anything Netanyahu says will either create a crisis in relations with President Biden or a crisis in the relations with his far-right coalition partners. There is very few words. Yeah, he has very few words that he can say that will bridge that. Besides which, his preferred option, which was actually to let Hamas remain in power, is unacceptable to the Israeli public. It certainly can't be articulated.
You think that's still his preferred option?
I don't know. Generally, his preferred option is to put off a decision until as late as possible and see what's available.
Well, whatever less politically costly for him.
Exactly. So right now, I'm sure he wants to destroy Hamas because it's unacceptable to do anything else, but I don't know where we'll be further down the line. So that's the first level. The second level is most of the IDF is concentrated on fighting this war, right? Having said that, the wider security services and parts of the IDF that deal with research are interested in this question and are asking people from outside as well as from inside to think about it. So there will be some thinking about it, but there hasn't been any action or any sort of working together to try and do it. There might have been some private conversations, but not more than that.
Okay, so you, I think in this article, want to, really helpfully outline various possible scenarios, ranging from, Hamas still staying in power, the status quo ante, through various options to the one that you recommend. Before we get to, can you just kind of walk us through these options, why you think some of them are just not feasible, not suitable, and then, tell us a little bit about the option that you and Toby recommend.
Sure. So I'm going to start with something that actually an option that we in the end cut because it's a non-starter, but Israelis like to talk about it, so I should talk about it. And that is the Israeli desire for Egypt to take over the Gaza Strip. Egypt will police it. There's only one problem with this. Egypt doesn't want to know and absolutely under no circumstances will take over. So that's why we didn't talk about that.
That's just a fantasy, basically. Yeah,
it's a fantasy. The Egyptians will play a role for sure, but they're not going to want to run the Gaza Strip. So that's the first thing. The first option is to go back to how it was before the Oslo peace process, which is Israel occupies Gaza, not in the sense that people say it does today, where there are no Israeli soldiers and no Israeli presence, but actually running the government of Gaza and actually policing Gaza with the IDF. So on the one hand, that will maximize the protection for your civilian population along the Gaza border. On the other hand, there are many, many reasons against this, and the Prime Minister's basically ruled it out. And the reasons are that it would, first of all, cost Israel a fortune to provide for 2 million Palestinians. Secondly, it would leave the IDF vulnerable to all sorts of terrorist attacks on a regular basis. And there's no stomach for running Gaza after having done it for a very long time. It would create massive tension with the United States, which is critical for Israel's much bigger security threats, which is mainly Iran, the Iranian nuclear program, and Iran's allies throughout the Middle East. And of course, it could shake Israel's peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan and the Gulf, particularly Egypt. And Egypt is the cornerstone of the whole peace process because it prevents a two-front war. It means that the IDF doesn't need to split itself in two. It can fight on one front against the conventional army.
So is there any option within Israel? I mean, is this the far right's kind of prefer? There's even some talk about, Israeli settlers returning.
Yeah. It's the far right. The far right oscillate between that and a dream that Egypt will take all 2 million Palestinians. They talk about Egypt's debt being wiped out, and in return for that, I mean, I can imagine Egypt taking some refugees, but not 2 million. And so it doesn't make any real difference in terms of the actual issue. So that would be the second option. The third option would be to have an international force. The problem with international forces is that what they have to do in order to maintain order is shoot local groups who want to cause trouble. And they have to be willing to be shot at and killed. And there has never been such an international force. It's now almost 20 years since the UN passed a decision for an international force to keep Hezbollah 40 kilometers from the border in the north of Israel. They are sitting 40 centimeters from that border. So this is it's a fantasy.
The Israeli public would not presumably, knowing the failure of UNIFIL in southern Lebanon and UN peacekeeping, they would not accept such an option.
They wouldn't accept it because it doesn't work, and it's counterproductive, if anything, because what we see is Hezbollah just hides behind UNIFIL. Yeah, that's what they do. So that's really it is a very bad and unworkable option. Something else that is spoken about is kind of a joint Arab, the countries that Israel has peace with, Egypt, Jordan, and some of the Gulf states from the Abraham Accords, bringing in a joint force. I think it's unlikely for a combination of the reasons that I mentioned to do with Egypt won't do it and why an international force won't work. Both the Arab states and Israel have been working for 50 years to separate the Palestinian issue from their bilateral relations. To then put themselves back in the middle of it, I don't see them wanting to do that. So I think we can discount that. So another idea that's been put forward is to just maintain a civil administration in Gaza, which means get rid of all the Hamas people who run the government at the higher levels and leave the lower level bureaucrats in place. And that would be a kind of learning the lesson of what happened in Iraq, where they kicked everyone out and then they created, the insurgency again. So this would kind of say, all right, we're not going to make so many people unemployed and not have an interest. We're just going to get rid of the higher echelons. I think there's something to this. I think this makes some sense. But there's a limitation, which is that the legitimacy for something like this doesn't exist unless it has some kind of political umbrella. Israel's tried this before. There was something in the early 1980s called the Village Leagues in the West Bank. And, even when the locals are willing, the amount of political and economic pressure and to administer something is not the same as to politically run it. And I think it would be it would crumble pretty quickly. Either that or it would suck Israel into running the Gaza Strip. So, I don't think it's workable on its own. The other option, the final option, is to bring in the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority resolves the problem of the political representation. So you can have the political representation, and that will be accepted broadly internationally and in the Arab world. Israel already deals with the PA in the West Bank. The security coordination is actually reasonably good. The PA does the light lifting, Israel does the heavy lifting. So a model whereby the PA does the policing of Gaza and Israel comes in when it's heavy duty stuff. That could work. What's the problems with the PA? The problem with the PA is, A, it's extremely unpopular in the West Bank It's very weak. It may collapse anytime soon. Its leader is very old, and there's going to be a crisis of leadership. Not only that, but in the last decade, since the former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad left office, PA has become extremely corrupt, extremely dysfunctional, much more authoritarian, and also its education system has changed. The resources it uses in its textbook, and they are now, basically encouraging murder. They're anti-Semitic. All the rest of it.
They didn't condemn October 7th, as far as I know.
It's and actually there was some celebration in UNRWA schools and all the rest of it. So there are really serious problems with the PA. And so what myself and Toby have tried to do is to take the positive elements from each of those options and knit them together to try and make a package that could be something that both Israel and Palestinians could benefit from, and that would have sufficient buy-in by actors from around and about. And it goes something like this. So in the short term, the IDF need to make sure that there is a stable security environment, and then to hand over the security side of things internally to the PA. The reconstruction of Gaza needs to be financed by the Gulf states, along with Western technical ability. The rule of Gaza should be under the umbrella of the PA, but should not be ruled by the West Bank Palestinian Authority. There is an opportunity here to create a much more functional, less authoritarian, more successful, more legitimate state structure. There's only ever been one Palestinian leader who's done a good job, and that's Salam Fayyad, who's the former prime minister 2007 to 30. And what he did was the economy improved, law and order improved on the streets, the rule of law improved, and he wasn't corrupt, which is part of the reason he fell, because he was too weak to stand up against the entrenched interests in Fatah in the West Bank. Now, there are no entrenched interests this time. He could be starting from zero. And the money that comes from everywhere would go through him. And therefore, that would give certain confidence to donors because he's got a track record that works. Now, it might not be him personally, because his position right now is something else, but he is the model. And you can imagine a sort of political technocratic, so they're previous members of the Palestinian Authority, but they're more independent, who would be under the umbrella internationally of the PA. They're not going to negotiate international agreements on their own, but they run Gaza, right? They run Gaza as a kind of like, you have like a federal system, right, in the US, okay? And I think that kind of mix is very attractive. It's attractive for Israel because the thing that's most important to Israel is the security. And we would be in a better position than we were before. From the Palestinian public's point of view, this would give them a chance to have a better life and with dignity. In other words, it's under something that you can call politically Palestinian. But as the President Biden says, a reconstituted Palestinian Authority. And I think perhaps without getting too messianic, one of the really nice things about this could be that it could provide Saudi Arabia a way in to the Abraham Accords. And this could have a much wider effect because right now, Iran and Hamas represent what Islam is. Now, if you had the keeper of the holy places making peace with Israel and being able to point to a place where, when we do things our way, the more moderate way, it's not a democracy, but it's freer. There's more rule of law. There's a better economy. Then they're presenting another model of Islam. And that's a real threat to Hamas and Iran, particularly Iran, which is Shia. There's 15% of Muslims are Shia. So Saudi Arabia could present something very different. Now, in order to seal that, Israel will have to give the Palestinians a horizon for two states.
This is what
Otherwise,
anticipated my question. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the tricky bit. You can't do it with this government. You can't do it with this government. This government,
there's no way that they're going to agree. Well, they'll fall apart.
It's a coalition of the corrupt and the extreme. There's no other way to say it. So there's nothing that can be hoped from. But there are things that Israel can do, particularly if President Biden is the kind of backstop to all of this, because he's got a lot of credit in the bank with the Israeli public, a hell of a lot. It would be unpopular, but he might be able to swing it. And that is to say, all right now the Palestinian Authority controls 40% of the West Bank. Why don't we expand some of that in civilian control, right? Not security control, just civilian control. I don't know, 15%, 20%, not the settlements, not the Jordan Valley, but there's plenty of other places. And then what we're trying to say to the Palestinians is, look, once we get over 50%, we're heading towards the horizon starts to look different. The horizon starts to look like maybe there is going to be a Palestinian state. And what we're saying is, right, it's the security issue that is the important one for us. Politically, we can't move settlements for the time being. Forget it. It just can't be done. But what we can say is, where there isn't a settlement, we can say you're in charge in civilian terms. And the sort of implicit messages is, if you can make this work, then this is something we can go forward to. And I feel that when Fayyad was prime minister, the administration and the Israeli government decided they would go with Abbas and try and negotiate a permanent status agreement. And we've been there so many times and failed every single time. And the problem is, when you went for Abbas, because Abbas opposed Fayyad, you basically allowed Fayyad to sort of, lose his power. So I would say that, if Hamas and the Islamists think in the long term, we also have to think in the long term. And I think the best thing that we can do is try and build up a better life for the Palestinians that works ground up, like the Yishuv in Zionism, okay? And then keep the horizon there and keep moving in the right direction, and just accept that it's a long game, right? And that it takes a lot of investment, and it is a fraught process. But we're in the sort of game here that was the Reformation of Christianity, the defeat of fascism. These things don't happen according to electoral calendars, but, never waste a crisis, right? This is a crisis where suddenly, if Israel is able to defeat Hamas militarily, there will be an opportunity that doesn't come along very often. And if we're prepared to invest and not expect everything to have results in 5 minutes, then I think this could really be an inflection point. Yes.
So I just maybe have time for one last question. I mean, what you've laid out is a very kind of sensible, rational argument for why this is the only really available other, a menu of not great choices. This is the least bad. But of course, as you noted, there's no chance that the present Israeli government, Netanyahu's coalition, which obviously includes the far-right parties who are kind of sworn opponents of the Palestinian Authority. There's no chance that they're going to accept this. So, given that, it's very difficult to see just how, Israel can promote this idea or even adopt it. I mean, because the government obviously has no incentive to move to early elections. They know that they're going to be, eviscerated at the polls. Likud going to lose much of its support. So how do you see this working, given the realities of Israeli politics and the basically the fact that now it's really up to the government to decide, more or less? They have to hold together to stay in power. And why would we think that somehow this rational option, right, is actually politically feasible in Israel?
Because Israel is a different place than it was on the 6th of October. Israel's secret weapon is its society. The goal of terrorism is to destroy morale, and instead of people going to the army to protect the country, they sit at home with a gun by the door and protect their family. Not only has that not happened, but Israeli society is made up for poor government performance. So you have, these hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced. This school in Jerusalem rings up a school, along the border, says, we've got this room, we've got this, we'll take your students here. Bottom up. And even the ultra-Orthodox are part of it. There's been thousands of ultra-Orthodox who've signed up to join the army, and others who've just gone round giving soldiers things. 70% of Israeli Arabs, according to an Israeli Democracy Institute poll, identify now with the state of Israel. That was 48% on the 6th of October. So my sense is there's going to be enormous pressure on this government. And I think there's a very good chance that it will crumble either from within, from Likud and the Haredim. I think the Haredim will see which way the wind is blowing. They're very, very pragmatic. And they may well say, bye-bye Bibi. Yeah? Or there may be just huge demonstrations that make his position untenable. So, there's no doubt that you're right to say that to actually get this off the ground, right, you need a different Israeli government. But I think that we can have one within 9 months. And I think that that is still within the time where the window can be open. But yeah, there's a lot of ifs and buts in my proposal. I just think that, like you said, given what's out there, they've got very, very little to lose by going for it, because whatever else is out there is so much worse that you might as well try. And in a way, that's the winning case in Israel, is that once you've looked at everything else, you might as well give it a go. What have you got to lose? Do you know what I mean? So the public right now can't hear this because, everybody's children are fighting Gaza right now. Everyone is like this, focused on a goal, and that's fine for the public. I think you can't expect the public to be anywhere else. It's not fine for the leaders, and they have to think strategically. And I know that Lapid is definitely thinking like this. The real question is what Benny Gantz thinks and what the people around him think. But he is much more busy with the actual war, right? Because he's in the security cabinet. So we'll have to see what people around him think. But they won't be against it. It's a case of whether they'll pick it up as theirs.
Do you think, as my final question then, knowing you said there is conversation, there is some discussion taking place behind the scenes within the kind of broader security establishment, is your sense, knowing that internal conversation, is your sense that what you're presenting really aligns with, is there a consensus emerging? Is there some, maybe not publicly stated that, or is there not yet within the security establishment any consensus?
No, there's no consensus. There's no consensus at all. What I think that the consensus could be that even the people that don't believe in this will think it's useful to put it forward, right? And and then if it works, well, that's very nice. But they are 99% sure it won't work. But they can understand the need that, you can't be something that Israel has to put something forward. And so why not put this forward? That could definitely play, particularly if it gets picked up by the other Arab actors. It will get picked up by President Biden. But if the Saudis have changed to saying we need to actually do something, right? Because previously it was, we want you to make peace with the Palestinians, but it's your business. And you'd ask them sort of, but what if we can do this some of the way? Will you kind of use your influence? No. That's you get on with it. It seems to me now that they might feel that they need to be a little bit involved, and that might jog people like Gantz to say, you know what, we should actually, this is worth getting behind. But those are a lot of ifs and buts. And as you said, we're recording this a week before it goes out, and by next week, who knows what the reality will be.
Nevertheless, I appreciate hearing some dose of optimism, at least some.
Don't say optimism. That's terrible.
Measured, cautious optimism.
Okay.
I want to thank you for sharing that with us, and for all the listeners, I would encourage you to read the article. It's entitled again, "An Israeli Strategy for PostHamas Gaza." I believe it's available on the website of the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, so you can check it out there. We will also post a link to it as well, so you can read it. I want to thank you, Professor Rynhold, Jonathan, for sharing your wisdom and your insights with us today. It's been a fascinating conversation, and not as depressing as some conversations that I've had on this topic. So thank you, and I want to thank all of our listeners as well for joining us. This has been an episode of Israel in Depth, produced by the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. Thank you for listening, and be on the lookout for more episodes soon. Thanks and goodbye.